Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. My name is Nikki Stones. I'm VP of Marketing at Ben, and I'm here to host your session. So the directive is going to fundamentally change how companies define, report and communicate compensation, not just salary, but bonuses, equity, pensions, and yes, benefits too. So whether you're deep in preparation already or just starting to pay attention, this directive is actually much more than a compliance exercise. It's your chance to bring greater clarity and consistency to how you talk about pay and to build more trust with your people along the way. Now, we've brought together three brilliant minds to help unpack it all today, from what's changing and where to start to the hidden risks and rewards of making pay more transparent. Let's start with some introductions. Adam, do you want to go first?
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Newton. I am the head of reward here at Fast Markets and looking forward to just talking to you all today.
Lovely. Thank you, Adam. And Colin?
Hello, everyone. My name is Colin Nichol. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Alexander Beard, and we're independent global employee benefit consultants.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colin. And last but not least, Nicole.
Thanks, Nikki. My name's Nicole Sims, and I'm the Global Research Manager here at Ben.
Lovely. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And of course, a big welcome to all of our listeners. We will have some time for questions at the end, so do put them in the chat as we go through and we'll get through as many as we can. All right. Well, to get us in the mood, we're going to kick things off with a quick poll. So I think it should pop up on your screen shortly. But which of the following EU countries has the largest gender pay gap, according to the 2023 report? I think we can all submit as well. Did you guys, is everyone getting it? Let's have a look. Yeah, answers coming in. Just give it a few more minutes. Yeah, not bad, not bad. So actually, the results are Germany is 17.2% pay gap, shortly followed by Finland 16.8, then France 12.2, Spain 9.2, and Belgium 0.7%. So yeah, a real range there. I think actually the EU average is 12%. The UK, obviously, sadly, no longer in the EU, but is at 7%. Just to kind of give you guys a bit of an idea there, but yeah, quite a spread of different pay gaps there. All right, so let's dig into things. I think, Nicole, it'd be great to kick off with you. Perhaps you can just give us a little bit of an overview. What is the EU Pay Transparency Directive and what's changing that employers need to care about?
Yeah, sure. So I think what a lot of people are looking at is the headline of the name of the directive. It's EU Pay Transparency, but that actually means something. It's quite extensive changes of what that actually means. So I think a lot of people would be quite comfortable with gender gap reporting. That's something that has existed across a lot of Europe, across a lot of other OECD countries, in just having to report kind of once a year if you're over 250 headcount. Something we have in the UK as well. But what this directive is doing is going a lot further. So it's looking at kind of being able to improve these figures, being able to improve gender equity across a number of measures. So for employees, there's a few more protections. There's now a ban on salary history inquiries during the interview process. Employees are able to request pay information to be able to see what is happening in their organization. The salary range must be disclosed before interview. So a couple of things on the employee side, but also for employers specifically, this pay gap reporting is getting much bigger. So it requires companies with more than 100 employees. It's going to be delivered in phases, but to provide a breakdown of median and mean pay gap, as well as looking at quartiles and categories of workers. But what's really exciting for us here at Ben is that the definition of pay is getting a little bit bigger as well. So at the moment, because it is done on a national basis, this normally just means salary. Sometimes it'll look into bonuses and things like that. But what the pay directive is doing is expanding this definition. It should include anything, any form of compensation that is related to your job. So this will include occupational pensions. We're talking about allowances, non-cash benefits, which I think is one of the bigger changes. yeah, I think the only thing I'll add on that is that there's also going to be a bit more of a mechanism for reporting as well, in that joint pay assessments are now required if any category of worker has more than a 5% gap.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, in terms of the timings for this, right? So the EU Pay Transparency Directive requires, I think it's all EU member states to introduce the new pay transparency measures and gender gap reporting by 7th of June 2026, and then reporting requirements start on the 7th of June 2027. I mean, Colin, that seems like a way away, 18 months till the reporting requirements. But I mean, what are you actually seeing from your clients? I mean, what sort of stage are people at in terms of preparation? Are they preparing? Are they panicking? Are they not thinking about this yet?
Well, I think you wouldn't be alone if you were panicking a little bit. It is a complicated topic to get on top of. I think clients tend to be in one of two camps. One, that they are quite well advanced, so they've managed to collect the data, analyze that data, and start to develop a strategy and put some resources together internally in order to roll that out. How I would say the majority of maybe smaller clients are just sort of trying to get to grips with what's actually required. And of course, until you know what is out there and what potential differences there are, you don't know exactly how much work and how big the project will be. So I think that the first thing at the moment is just to really get to grips with the data and analyze that. And then you can start developing your plan.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, Adam, what about for you at Fast Markets? Where are Fast Markets sort of starting, and why? How are you thinking about this and pay transparency more broadly?
So I think, sort of bringing a bit of context, we are a relatively new organisation. So we became a organisation as a spin-off. We were bought out of a much larger listed organisation. We've got about 775 employees now. We're growing globally. And in Europe specifically, that's a sort of key that 100 heads are in Bulgaria. So we absolutely got a key eye on Bulgaria and what's going on there, the legislation there. But they're also currently a bit sidetracked. They're about to adopt the euro in January. So probably expecting Bulgaria to come with some more information maybe in 2026, if not a bit later. But we're relatively small around the rest of Europe. But I think when we look at this, and kind of, it's more for us about what are we trying to achieve. So I joined the business 2 years ago and we didn't have a reward strategy at all. So when I implemented a reward strategy, we've got key elements there. We talk about commitments to fairness and transparency, and that really rides through everything that we've looked to do over the past 2 years. So specifically on that fairness and transparency pace, which I think is kind of what ultimately the law is trying to get to, if you kind of tailor it all back from all the sort of requirements to what's the real point of what we're doing here. We've specifically looked at 2 really key projects over the last year or so. One is in the benefit space. We've got a really large global benefit project going on to ensure that we have fair and transparent benefits across the globe, and also the same benefits irrespective of how senior or junior you are, really talking to some of that transparency piece and trying to make sure we're not being unfair to anybody. We've done a massive job architecture piece as well, trying to work out where people sit, and all of that also leads to ultimately to some of these reporting requirements where we know we have to report and actually fairly check on how we're doing versus these requirements. I guess one other thing to mention is sideline to this is we've implemented an HR system, right? So without all that, reporting is an absolute nightmare. You're working on hundreds of spreadsheets. It's a load of maths and a lot of keyboard tapping. So having a system means you can now start to really accurately report all this stuff, and that's really vital to what we do.
Yeah, absolutely critical, I would say. And we'll dig into your job architecture project a bit later, actually, Adam, because I think that's really interesting. And actually just show, this is really best practice anyway. This is how companies should be thinking about some of these things, regardless of the directive. I mean, Colin, a point Adam raised there about if you've got things in lots of different places and how difficult this can be on reporting. I mean, on the operational sort of friction side of things, like what new pressure in reality is this putting on companies operationally? There's a lot of different sort of new elements for organizations. What do they need to be thinking about?
I think it is putting companies under pressure, particularly obtaining the accurate data on the situation that they've got in their various countries. As Adam said, the directive is initially mandatory for 100 plus employees in that particular country. But many companies are looking at this taking it as an opportunity to look more holistically across the whole of the EU, and trying to align similar policies across multiple countries, even if you have less than 100. There are some good systems out there that help you, once you've sort of collected the data, analyze that and look at gaps. But we have found that some clients have identified, particularly in one country, Germany, where a set of employees were receiving pension contributions which were higher than the norm. And that was a historic reason for that, because they came out of a defined benefit scheme into a money purchase arrangement. But the directive does actually cover benefits as well, with the concept being equal pay for equal work. So it's really important that you sort of have a really good data to be able to sort of identify if there's anything that's different like that. And it's not to say that you can't have differences there, but you have to be able to justify that. And also the communication to your employees has to be very fair and open, so that you build trust amongst your employees.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe just to sort of drill down a little bit onto a bit more of the directive, Nicole, just to help put some context. The directive talks about reporting by categories of workers. Can you actually just explain that to our audience? What does it mean by that? Why does that matter?
Yeah, so I think the way that a lot of this reporting done at the moment is really done at that macro level. So it'll look at the business as a whole. And so what the response is from a lot of companies is that they could have these big numbers. They could have gaps of 10+% in both their mean and their median, but that doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening in terms of individual workers. So everyone who has one job may get paid the same, regardless of their gender, as is required under other discrimination laws. But then because just from a headcount, there's, for example, more men in certain jobs or more women, then it starts to skew the data in a way that on a snapshot version could be a little bit misleading. So what the EU directive does is it requires, or is going to require, reporting by categories of workers. So it is a bit of a heavy lift from companies to be able to actually categorize workers for equal work. So making sure that the categories are divided in an appropriate way for their company. But then the reporting is done off that. So rather than just looking at that massive macro level, it'll give a little bit of an idea to make sure that it is equal pay for equal work rather than across the whole company. And that is also when we talk about joint pay assessments. So when there is a trigger to do a reporting audit, that will be at the category level rather than at the macro.
Yeah, and also then, I mean, just building on that a bit as well, you mentioned in the introduction, Nicole, that there's a legal requirement now to publish salary ranges. Employees can also request information and things like what sort of impact is that going to have? Like, how do companies need to be thinking about that? And sorry, Nicole, that was for you.
Is that for me? Yeah, so I think that it does show how much it is at different levels of the organization. So when we're talking about advertising roles, that's maybe more of a HR thing than a payroll thing. So it is all about this idea of creating as much as transparency as possible at different stages in the process, so that overall there's less opportunity for this inequality to creep in a lot of in very conscious ways, but also in unconscious ways. So for example, as you mentioned, what is now required is that when advertising a role, not necessarily advertising a role, before the interview stage, employers have to disclose what the salary range is for a specific role. We are already seeing that some countries are going to go a little bit earlier than that and require that the pay be advertised at the point that the job ad is published. But this means that there is it kind of removes a lot of discretion where kind of unconscious biases can creep in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Adam, then obviously, this transparency is a really positive thing, and for the employees, but it could inevitably surface some quite uncomfortable truths about pay discrepancies. How do you navigate this at Fastmarkets? Like, how are you thinking about this, and as part of your, the job architecture sort of work you've been doing?
Yeah, we've had, I guess, first of all, when you kind of take a step back, you know, it's easy for me to think about pay as just part of my job. You know, I've been working in reward my whole career, but it's such an emotive topic. And, you know, things come across my desk on a daily, weekly basis, and there's so much emotion about how much you're paid, and that always brings up challenges and can bring up difficult conversations. Also, I think one of the challenges we've also got is that a lot of people believe that pay and reward sits in a black box where someone in a dark room and makes decisions on people's pay without all of the right sort of thoughts at mind. So I think what we're trying to do here is we've seen a number of situations. I think if you look at, we've hit that 250 threshold from a UK perspective for gender pay reporting. So we've had to start to articulate, and not only articulate, but also myth bust what that means. You know, it doesn't mean always that, you know, if you've got a gender pay gap, that the person next to you who might be a different gender is paid a different amount. It could mean many things. So it's an education piece. We've also done, we've looked at how we've done our pay review. We've made some changes there. And obviously we're doing this architecture project. In all of those pieces, it's about, I think from my perspective, trying to be as transparent and clear about what we do and why. So what are our levers that we're putting here, why people are paid differently, and also having an openness for sort of challenge and that transparency and conversation as well. So happy for people to challenge things, and, you know, ultimately there'll be legacy, there'll be challenges. I think this conversation's already met, you know, things have happened in the past way before all of our times in organizations, and there will be problems, and we just have to be honest about them and tackle them head on and deal with them when they come up. But I think it's sort of setting up a real honesty up front about, this is what we do, this is why we do it, this is our strategy. Let's make sure all these changes and all differences in pay are aligned to that. And if not, let's have a really honest conversation about how we can sort of change any legacy that we might have inherited.
Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, presumably you mentioned education there, but also as well, there's going to need to be some, it's like communication or education and communication training on this for the managers and people internally as well, right? To be able to communicate. We
did a big piece in our pay round just come out about from last year. So our pay round is for the beginning of the year, and towards that we had a big piece with our managers, and we did lots of training and webinars, and I partnered with our L&D director, and we sat and basically had a loads of online webinars to people just talking about that. How can we communicate better about pay? How can we discuss why you've got this salary increase, why you've got this bonus, what's going on here, to really help people understand more, so that you know, the worst thing you want to do is people not understanding it and then coming to the wrong conclusion when the best of intentions have happened. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Nicole, as well, just sort of reflecting on some of the things we've talked about today and some of the conversations that you're having on a daily basis. I mean, what do you think is like sort of one thing that's actually going to catch employers off guard with everything here in terms of their preparations?
Yeah, I think Colin briefly touched on this before, but I think it's understanding how messy compensation data is. If you haven't looked into this before or tried to collate it, the way that systems work, the way that legacy systems work, the way that, you know, certain tech platforms work means that it may be you may have all these numbers, but they're in completely different places, in completely different formats. They then don't necessarily align with these categories that are going to have to be created. So I think that particularly for those that maybe aren't thinking about this yet or haven't started early, they may get a little bit caught by how much work is actually going to be required to comply with these new changes. And that is talking about just in the first instance, in that first reporting, but also it's an ongoing thing. So not just getting the data now, but then putting in place systems that mean the data is available for when the reporting deadlines pop up in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, also the fact that it's now obviously much more than just pay. It's the benefits, it's the bonuses, it's the equity, it's the pensions. Like that presumably adds obviously a lot more complexity to sort of tracking that and reporting.
So much more complexity. And I think that some of the things you just named there, for example, the pension, that has a monetary value, and well, employers should know how much is going out towards that. But it's going to include non-cash benefits as well. So things like company cards that maybe it's not as easy to understand like how much something costs or what the value is for the purpose of a compensation package. Stipends, allowances, reimbursements, things that have multiple steps or that are different per employee level can start to get a little bit more complicated, which the end goal is that it means that the reporting is much more comprehensive, but the steps in between do put that onus on the employer to be able to quantify this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, Colin, then when we think of like the sort of the impact that this will have at a kind of higher level, what do you sort of anticipate in terms of, do you think we'll see more standardized benefits, more personalized benefits? And what do you think the sort of knock-on effect of this will be?
Well, I do think, as Nicole said, that companies are seeing, when they're looking into the data, some anomalies, maybe some perks that have historically been given to people who have been in the business a long time, and that doesn't quite sit right with the concept of the directive. I think it's a great opportunity for companies just to take the opportunity to review their overall benefit strategy across each country, but also across all their regions. We're starting to see a strategy of sort of standardizing certain core benefits, whether it be health, pension, life assurance, that's core across the sort of culture and the values of the client across multiple countries, and then overlaying that with a more flexible maybe perks or selected benefits on a country by country basis, still to reflect the local market. So you're getting that sort of holistic global standardization of the key core strategies, and then you're just making that adaptive to the local market, but still making sure that the value is equal for equal work. I think a lot of companies are struggling then with how you communicate that, and that's the key part of this, is to make sure that you're taking your staff with you. They trust what you're doing, and it's seen to be fair. Many companies are using total rewards systems from online portals, etc. What we've picked up, you have got to be a bit careful with those, is that traditionally they report the value and the cost of providing a benefit. And sometimes the benefit costs more money for one person than another, maybe due to age, for example, with life assurance or health cover. And if you're displaying the cost to the company of providing that benefit in the total reward statement, you might be opening yourself up to showing that one person doing exactly the same work is receiving a greater value than someone else. So I think that's just a little bit about looking at how you communicate those differentials, and making sure the language that you use just refers to the benefit levels rather than the cost of those benefits.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Colin. And then Adam, you mentioned obviously earlier your job architecture work and the work that you've been doing on sort of defining and standardizing, the different elements of compensation across levels and job families. Can you just tell us a little bit more about actually that project, any kind of key learnings, the catalyst behind it?
I think the catalyst was a number of reasons. First of all, trying to break down sort of process barriers within the business, and also ultimately going back to, I guess, what this legislation is all about. It's all about transparency, because we inherited a business. We're very much kind of standing up alone as an organisation, and we inherited about 550 job titles for 700 people. So you could be sitting in a room with 5 other people with completely different job titles. You all did the same thing. Why? Because of lack of processes, legacy acquisitions, and all these good things. So what we were trying to do is help employees with transparency and career journeys. Where can my career go at fast markets? It's impossible to map it right now because everyone's called something completely different. But let's try and get some standardization, as in we all understand what inherently people's roles are, even if their job titles aren't going to change. Help them plan their career journey. Obviously, the reporting point is really key. And now I can actually see what we're using a broad band, what band people are, what is a relevant level between different people across functions, across geographies, across locations, across every way we can split the data. So we can really then understand as an employer what jobs we have, what people are doing in what country, and then that can help us report better, understand discrepancies and tackle them head on, and be more strategic in where we want to place people across the business. And I guess kind of going back to Colin's point earlier, interesting that you mentioned about standardization and flexibility. That's exactly what we've done here. So we've inherited a business. We've said, here are the minimum standards on benefits globally. And we are going to have those minimum standards across the board. And we're going to have, the market level of life assurance in every single country, or et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to do a flexible allowance, have flexible benefits everywhere else. So that's exactly what we've done as a business. And obviously with Ben in all countries as well. There we go. There's the plug you really wanted.
Thanks, Adam. And I mean, any kind of key learnings to share, Adam, from the project, or anything that comes to mind?
I think international complexity is a real key element. Ensure, and also compliance being a real challenge. It's an ambitious project. We're about 8 or 9 countries, and we've got some small countries in there as well, people with 20, 30 people. It's an ambitious project to provide everyone with minimum standards, which is, I think, the easy bit, but an allowance and then the ability to have flex in all those countries is the sort of more challenging area, where we're trying to provide flex in markets necessarily where that isn't always on the agenda or really happening a lot. So the compliance has been a complex one. But I think what's really important for us is that we can talk about one brand, with branding this as fast markets rules across the globe, and we can talk about one sort of way of working or way of providing benefits to everyone everywhere. And that's really key for us. And when you go kind of pay all that back to fairness and transparency, that's what we're looking to achieve here across the board. That wherever you work, whatever country, whatever level of seniority in the business, you still have access to the same concept of benefits and the same fair benefits across the globe.
Yeah, that's great. And actually that leads us on then. I mean, I think now, obviously, we've sort of talked through the directive, like what's coming in, some of the things that are going to be challenging. But let's start to think a bit about actually what companies can and should be doing right now. So maybe Nicole, to you first. I mean, what are the key things you've mentioned? Obviously, getting a handle on the data, but just sort of building on that. If someone's just getting started on the journey.
Yeah, so I think a caveat that we do need to put in, and it's something that Adam mentioned earlier before with the example in Bulgaria, is that while it is the EU Pay Transparency Directive and the EU published this a couple of years ago now, we are still waiting for it to be transposed into local legislation. And that means that while the Pay Directive as written will be the minimum and maybe something that companies can start planning for, there is still a chance that we'll see different numbers. So it may be a lower headcount on reporting, or a lower gap trigger before you have to do a joint pay assessment. So there are still a couple of things that are floating around and may change. And I know that we're kind of keeping an eye on them at Ben, and I'm sure that lots of companies who spread their headcount across the EU are also keeping an eye on that as well. So I just wanted to flag that, but that doesn't mean that you can't not start. So yeah, I think that definitely the data piece. Also, maybe not in the official compliance way, but the earlier that companies can map their current state and have an understanding of their current state of affairs, the better. So kind of maybe looking into softwares that can do that for them, getting the data together, that's all going to be really helpful, so that when we do have a little bit more information or the legislation comes into effect in the relevant countries, then companies are ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting as well, isn't it? Because some countries have already got some sort of regulations and things in place already. Of course, for some, it's completely new as well, right? So it's going to depend where your footprint is and things like that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that will also change how this is implemented. So in countries where there isn't pre-existing legislation on this topic, then they're more likely to follow the text of the EU directive. Whereas there are countries such as Ireland that already had they already have pay gap reporting, and they already have legislation on this topic, and it already includes headcounts. It's reporting for 50 people off the top of my head. And so if they're then transposing just parts of the legislation, that's also going to affect how that looks on a national level.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Colin, what in terms of sort of the clients and the people you're talking to, what are you advising sort of beyond what Nicole's mentioned? And, firstly, that question also, I mean, you mentioned things like the TRS systems and things, but other kind of tools and like actually platforms and things that you think HR teams are going to need to be able to manage this effectively?
Yes, I guess you could categorize those into three areas. One is the collection of your data, and that might be through your payroll provider, obviously, or Workday or HR systems. And then there are specialized providers that are offering analysis software. For example, Syndio is a good provider, but there's many others out there that can help you sort of make sense of that data and spot the gaps, etc., and help you devise that policy. And then I guess it's all around making a really positive message to the employees, and the systems that can help you do that are the employee benefit systems. That's a great way of doing that. If you've already got a system, then it's just making sure that the wording on it is compliant and adaptive and in the spirit of the directive. If you don't have a platform, it's an opportunity maybe think of implementing that to help support that message, and it makes it really easy as well to make sure the communication that you're offering to employees is compliant. So an employee benefits portal is a very useful way of doing that for the communication stage of that process. But I would echo what Nicole and you said, Nikki, in terms of be prepared for differences in the different countries on how prepared they are. There's a big difference between, say, Germany and even on the poll that we saw at the beginning of the session of other countries. So you just be prepared for different workloads depending on where you're located. But definitely there is technology out there and systems that will support you through the rollout.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Colin. And I mean, we've talked a lot, about the compliance, but actually, it's always good to sort of finish on a positive note. So, what about the opportunities of this? I mean, maybe one for you, Adam, just to get your perspective on how this level of transparency with rewards and compensation can actually help to boost employee satisfaction and recruiting. I mean, ultimately, the goal of what the directive is actually trying to achieve, and how you see that playing out in the real world.
Yeah, I think historically we've not been that transparent, and we've also not been very visible with how we pay, but also the wider piece, the benefits piece. So the real project that we're doing from a global benefits perspective is to take all of our practices across the globe, and it's really varied from sort of quasi-flex in some of our largest countries of the UK and the US to sort of rudimentary practices in some of our smaller locations, whereby the office manager would go to the local insurance companies and see what they can get at a good deal. So we've had a real wide load, but what we've seen then is that we haven't been, when we've been recruiting, we haven't been sort of talking about it, shouting from the rooftops, and having the ability to have really clear platforms, clear processes, and really kind of, I guess, really great benefits that are transparent and fair across the board to all employees, irrespective of whether you are senior person with massive team or, entry level, just starting your career, means that we can, it's part of our value proposition. So we can go to market with it as a really great opportunity to say, look what we can do, and actually, look what we can provide you here. And as a truly global business, we've got people working with people in maybe 5 or 6 other locations within teams. They can all talk the same language. So wherever you are, whether you're in the US with their really expensive benefits that you have to provide because of healthcare and things there, or whether you're in Bulgaria, which was originally one of our lower cost locations, you're all talking the same language, the same concepts, and you can really then foster that culture and that brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will open it up to questions. Actually, now there are a couple coming through, but I mean, Nicole, Colin, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think Adam articulated it really well. I think this is coming in, and companies have to do this anyway. So turn it into a really positive thing. Like use the data and use this opportunity to look at your HR systems, and also then reflect that onto your brand as a good place to work.
Yeah, I would just echo that. It's great to hear what Adam's doing in his business, and I think that's the opportunity that everyone has to turn what is a directive, a regulation, into an opportunity, and to really support your culture of your business, make sure that things are fair, there's trust with your employees, and I think people want that. People want to work for a company that seems to be fair and is fair, and I think that brings great opportunities for companies that can seize this as a way to improve and move forward with their benefit strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, Colin. All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. So we've got a couple in, but if anyone has any others, then please do ask. All right, I will open these up. So first one from Ilana: is the consideration based on each country separately, so minimum number of employees, or on the entire EU region? In other words, if I only have 15 employees in Germany, does the law not apply to me? Nicole, that sounds like that's up your street.
I can take that one. So it is based on each country. This goes back to the idea that the legislation will be implemented at the national level. So even though it is an EU directive, it's still going to be transposed into local law. If you only have 15 employees in Germany, but you have 250 in France, then you only need to report in France. To go back to what we've been saying, though, this is also a choice, I think, like as in if you do want to operate fairness across all your EU, across the entire EU region, then there's nothing stopping you from reporting if you're under the headcount.
Yeah, makes sense. And one from Kristen here. So how should we address global benefit inconsistencies? So some countries are well above market, others far below. Should we keep improving high-performing locations or focus on closing gaps? Could this raise pay transparency concerns in a globally distributed teams? Who wants to take that, Colin?
Yes, I mean, I would remember it's the directive is per country, so not necessarily across various different countries. So I think it's important just to still take your benchmarking information and make sure that your benefit strategy and your pay strategy is in line with the benchmark and where you want to position. So I think it's it's important to keep in mind the local market as well as as trying to get a uniform strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Colin. One from Carolyn here. Is the EU PTD based on, I've never heard it, I've never seen it written like that. I was like, what's that? It's the topic of the webinar. Is the Pay Transparency Directive based on employing entities within an organisation in a country, or the country's overall headcount across multiple employing entities within that country?
That's a great question. I think it's going to depend on the specific legislation and how employees are categorized as part of an employing entity. I hesitate to provide much more information than that. I think it's going to align quite similarly to what you already have in a lot of the gender pay gap reportings. And then again, it's up to the individual employer to decide if they want to report that as kind of one whole thing, or if they, just in terms of how it's published and how it's seen in the public. But yeah, it will depend on the definition of kind of what an employee is in the specific national legislation.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. We did have one other actually here on certain countries having stricter requirements on reporting. How would you recommend approaching those if you have different headcounts in multiple EU countries? I think we've sort of covered that, but I don't know if there's any other comments on that one.
Yeah, I guess the aim of the directive is to make it more make the rules consistent across the EU, and although certain countries are more advanced in getting to that position, everybody needs to be in place by the 1st of June. So that's the key thing.
Yeah.
But many of the main parts of the directive are actually really good best practice, which you might want to spread across other areas of the business. If it's a global business operating, for example, the UK is outside of the EU, but you might want to bring that best practice into all the areas that you operate in.
Absolutely. Question here from Heidi. How do we need to treat benefits choices, i.e. when an employee can choose to take a benefit or not? Do they need to be included in the analysis?
So this would it's a terrible answer, but it depends on the benefit. So for things, once it becomes compensation, once it becomes part of pay, then it does need to be reported. So I think that an example would be if you have a €500 working from home allowance and that is given to the employee, then that needs to be counted. If you operate maybe on a reimbursement basis, so the allowance isn't handed out until after the fact, then that may be treated differently. I am aware that I sound like a broken record, but it's also going to depend on what the definition of pay is in the national law. But yeah, I think a lot of these things, particularly when there's choice, but once it's paid out, once it is kind of become a piece of compensation for the employee, then that's when it needs to be counted.
I think it's also important just to be aware of what benefits you are offering, because if you were to offer, for example, a benefit that was that one particular sex took up or found more engaging than another sex, and therefore there was different take-up rates to that benefit, then that could be something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. Good point.
And if I can add to what Colin said, because that's a great point. If that is the reason that your gap is bigger or above what the reporting trigger is, then that is also something that can then be put into the joint pay assessment. If there is objective criteria as to why the gap is big, and maybe it's because a benefit is taken up by one gender more than another, then that is something that will come out in the reporting. It also gives you an opportunity to maybe ask the question of why.
Yeah, good point, Nicole. Right, we've got another question in here, maybe time for one more after that if anyone has any, and then we will close. But one from Pierce here. Does the directive mention any specifics on gender used for reporting, i.e. gender at birth or gender as self-identified, or perhaps this will be something each country transposes differently?
Yeah. So, am I back?
Yes.
He has answered his question in the second half of the question, which is that it's going to depend on the definitions in national law. So I know that the conversation we've been having today is incredibly binary. In the EU directive, there is a clause that says it's up to national definitions of how we do gender, but I think for the sake of reporting, they talk about it as men and women. If there is a third or other gender, then it will depend on how national legislation looks at that. But at the moment, the way that's done in, for example, the UK is they're just we just look at men and women in the statistics, and then any third or other gender is not necessarily included at the moment. But yeah, it'll depend on how it's identified at the national level.
Great, thanks for that clarification, Nicole. All right, well, I think that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for all of the questions. Very much a hot topic on people's minds at the moment, clearly. Big thank you to all of our speakers. At Ben, we have actually put together a bit of a preparation checklist, so we will share that with you all in the coming days, along with the recording of this. And, you know, do obviously, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us, or of course to Adam, Colin, Nicole, and do make sure that you follow and subscribe to Ben on LinkedIn and YouTube to make sure that you don't miss any future events we have on the topic. Thank you all very much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.